Hello, and welcome to our next module, which explores politics in contemporary Israel. In the former module, we've explained why the idea of Israel as both a Jewish state and a democratic state is problematic. However, now let us focus on one of the main aspects that makes the claim that Israel is a democracy so important. And that aspect is the political landscape and the political parties shaping Israeli politics since 1948. The discussion, the debate on whether Israel is a democracy or not often relates to the fact that Israel has a functioning government that has routinely transitions between the right and the left. So let us explore this functioning process of government change and how the landscape in Israel politics was shaped. So we can do it by focusing on several significant periods and how the political alignment between the right and the left in Israel has been shifting. So between 1948 and 1992, we can talk about an age of a two main party system. When Israel was established, it adopted the Westminster module, which resembles mostly the UK, in which you have a coalition government versus an opposition party. The coalition government is voted into office in a regular election. These are not, you do not select a parliamentarian, but rather the lists of each party are determined by a centralized body or by primaries. And the party that wins the election gets to appoint a prime minister, which then appoints its own government, which is supposed to rule for the next 4 years. Between 1948 and 1992, there were two main parties dominating that cycle. First, until 1977, the Mapai party, which later became the Labour Party, which was the party established in the State of Israel and promoted an idea of socialism or socialist centralist state that controls the economy, the culture, and most of the aspects of life of the country. And then from 1977, the Likud party, which is a unique brand of liberalism and nationalism, a right-wing party, which as the years went by, became more and more focused on hard right policies towards Palestinians, both citizens and people and Palestinians living in the occupied territories, but also a hawkish position towards the Arab neighbors of Israel. After 1992, there is a shift in Israeli politics in which both of these parties the power has been eroded, and there is a significant rise of more centralist parties, and especially a bloc of ultra-Orthodox religious parties committed to the needs and interests of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, which also is referred to as the Haredim. This community is less assimilative to the Israel's secular, shall we say, secular cultural, Western-oriented norms of the country, and is a more isolationist sector in Israeli society. Nevertheless, the parties committed to that sector in Israeli society has become more and more powerful. And there is a shift from the 1990s towards less coherent parties and more blocs. So we can talk about the right-wing bloc, which usually entails the Likud party together with the ultra-Orthodox and the settler parties which represent the Israeli settlers living within the occupied territories beyond Israel's internationally recognized borders. And the center-left bloc, which is considerably smaller or have been historically smaller than the right-wing bloc, which incorporates basically the leftovers of the once ruling Labour Party and a constantly shifting landscape of parties which are established towards each election cycle, representing the interests of Israel liberal middle-class societies or sectors. Alongside this, we have several parties which represent the Palestinian citizens of Israel, which, as I said, have the right to vote, unlike the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are under Israeli military control. Those parties consider themselves as non-Zionist parties and therefore are participating in the Israeli elections but are declaratively non-affiliated with Zionist ideals and are historically always in opposition and rarely are given any seat at the coalition table. I want to just focus on two important and complementary trends in Israeli politics which correlate or chime with the paradox and contradictions we've discussed so far in this course. The first is the clear rise of the far right. In today's Israeli government, as we film this course, Israel have two cabinet ministers, the chancellor and the minister of national security, which is entrusted on governing the police. Both of these two ministers come from the very far right of Israel. One of them, the minister who is in charge on the police, is actually a convicted felon with the charges of terrorism that was a surveillance target of the Israeli security services. However, he is popular enough and got enough support to be appointed to the Minister of National Security. The reason to the rise of the right, there are several reasons to that, not just one. First of all, demographically speaking, this bloc has been growing in numbers since the establishment of Israel. It managed to gain footing by the success of Israel colonization of the West Bank and the rise in numbers of settlers, and of course who wants to guarantee their interests and therefore are voting in greater numbers. It builds on the fact that Israel's society is more conservative and traditional rather than liberal and left-leaning. Its commitment to theological legacies, for instance, the idea of returning to the homeland, strike a chord with many Israelis who feel that they want to support this idea, which is basic to the national narrative, which is Zionism. But perhaps most importantly, it is the collapse of the peace process, especially since the 1990s, which presented this idea that there is no Palestinian partner, that gained so much footing within Israeli society that catapulted leaders from the extreme right into a position in which they have been forming most of the governments and most of the coalition parties since 1995, basically. As a mirror image of that, we can talk about a clear decline of Israel's left. First of all, the question whether in Israel there is a left, the way we define a left in the UK or in the US or in the West, is in itself a discussion, a contested discussion, because the left has always been committed to the same national agenda, which does not regard Palestinians as equal citizens of the state, for instance. And since the 1970s and 80s, most of the parties which were defined as leftists chose a more liberal stand when it comes to individual human rights and other issues concerning liberal values, but less commitment to socialist values or social democratic norms, and were full partners in the development, economically wise, of Israel as a neoliberal economy, for instance. However, in addition to that, we can talk about the demographic decline in the historical groups which formed the historic bloc of the left. We can talk about the fact that the Israeli public, as I said, is more tilting toward values which are associated with the right, whether it's a free market or national strength and national security, and the left has always been in complex relations with both of them. But much like the rise of the right, the demise of the left is related to the collapse of the peace process and to the inability to bring a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli violence which has shaped Israel since 1948. So in our next module, the final for this course, we will talk a little bit more about how the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis and an incongruency of Israel as a society and a state should shape the way in which we need to understand Israel's regime as a whole.